Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you for the invitation to this strange online world that we all float around in. It's very nice to be here and collide with you today. So I'm going to give a talk today, and I've called it Collective Action and Collective Experience. And it's really sort of two different projects that have come from different areas and are sort of now in the same space. And I began doing work in this sort of area, really just looking at pairs at sort of the lowest level of this collaboration. This is work that I did on what we call social context. The basic question in my lab is to look at a psychological process like how you talk, how you listen, how you think. How does that individual process change as a function of the other people around you? And often we miss that question in psychology, not the people probably at this conference, because lots of our experiments are done on small lab cubicles by yourself. We just test individuals, and by its very nature, we sort of exclude lots of these social factors. We leave them at the laboratory door. So I was interested in bringing them back, and we began with work like this. So what you're looking at there is someone talking about their favorite episode of Friends, and where the speaker is looking is a crosshair, and two listeners are listening as well, and those are dots. And what we try to do here is use a technique called cross-recurrence analysis that will come back throughout this talk to try and put a number, let me see if I can play that again, to try and put a number on the degree to which the listener was chasing around the speaker. And what we find is if people are attentive, then they're sort of chasing that crosshair around with a lag of about 2 seconds. About 2 seconds after a speaker looks at something, the listener looks at it too. And we're able to quantify this loose temporal coupling and relate it to how well you remembered, how much you understood, your shared common ground during this discourse. So we're trying to put numbers on how individuals are coupled here, engaged in a dialogue. Actually, not a dialogue, this is a monologue. Later on, we did look at real conversations, two people speaking over headsets who were looking at the screen where they had people on screen telling them things about a particular news item. So you saw people talking about the Gulf War, one of the Gulf Wars, I forget when this was, and then they would have their own conversation about that while we tracked their eyes. So this is the eye movements of two people, there are dots. They were looking at a completely blank screen, having their conversation. But what we found is even though they were looking at absolutely nothing, their gaze was coupled, because they're looking back to areas of the screen that used to contain people whose opinions they're discussing. So they're referencing past information. And this was sort of a turning point personally in my career when I started to think about coordination, because I began as a vision scientist thinking about the eyeball as a perceptual device that takes in information. But here you have two people systematically looking at absolutely nothing, not taking any information with their eyes at all, just listening to each other, and in virtue of that, coordinating their behavior, coupling this little eye movement dance around a completely blank display. So this became very interested in me, and I became very interested in this, I should say. And we started to do experiments to look about, well, what does it matter that you believe about the other person? Does their identity matter? How do you coordinate your gaze with them? Does this happen at sort of a lower end of cognition, or is it at the very sort of first moments of moving your attention? Is there effect of you having beliefs about another person who might or might not be there? But I'm going to sort of skip over many years and jump straight to the work that we do with larger groups, since that's what you people are more interested in. And what I'm going to talk about is two things. One is collective action, by which I really mean decision making, mostly in this talk. How people together make decisions, how they choose to act in a certain way together with each other, or even in competition with each other. Then in the second half of the talk, I will try and move on to talking about collective experience, trying to put a number on this thing that we are all desperately missing, which is being around more than, I can't be around more than 5 other people or I will get arrested in my country, in London right now. We are all missing this experience of going to a football match, of going to the theatre. And we are painfully aware now of what is missing. When we did this research, it was more sort of abstract. Now it's been thrown into painful relief. But how do we put a number on the value of that collective experience? Is it really true that we value a play more surrounded by 1,000 other people watching it? Is there really a shared aspect of this that adds to that experience? How do we capture that and how do we measure it? That'll be the second half of the talk. But what I want to do first is to look at some of our work on decision making, on how you make choices together with other people. And this might be terribly ill-advised, but we're going to try and do a demo. This is using a system that we have called the Hive, that Irina von Zimmerman, my grad student and postdoc, and I developed. And it's a tool to do experiments with large numbers of people who are physically co-present, which we're not, and no one can be right now. But I'm going to try and use the same system distributed across the world. So normally we would all be sat in the same room looking at a big screen. But I'm going to try and share my screen and see if we can use this tool as well. It may be that the lag bouncing around defeats us. If so, that's fine, but we will give it a go. So to take part in this demonstration, take your, probably a phone is easiest to use if you have a phone that's anything with an internet connection, and go to thehive.sc. If you do that, you will see a web page and a big orange button that says join the audience. If you click on that button, then you are asked your age, your gender. You can skip that. You don't have to enter that unless you're particularly proud of it. And then at the bottom, it says the room or the room number. And there, I just want you to type in the word demo, uppercase, lowercase, it doesn't matter. And then click consent and enter if you do indeed consent. And if you do that, hopefully you should end up in the Hive. And as I say, we'll give this a few moments to see if the technology is anything like working. Perhaps the lag will defeat us, as I say. So I'm going to share my other window now, move over to this one. So I'm on the Hive, it's working for me. So you should be able to see this screen on your computer in front of you. And on my phone, I've got a little blue dot like that. And if I drag that blue dot there, then a blue dot on the screen in front of me is moving around. Oh, there's someone else. That could be Amela joining us too. So I'm moving my dot here, and I can see the movements of other people's dots as many other people join the room. We have 3 people now, and we can drag our dots around and we can chase each other. Now, I'm not sure what the lag is. It's quite good for me, but of course, that's because I'm sat in front of the screen. But we can use this system with, I think the most we've used is about 120 people, all in the room together with a mass of dots like a swarm of bees, which is why it's called the Hive. So what we're going to do now, I'll just give a few more moments for other people to join. We have about 10, it's racking up quickly now. If you want to join later on as we started, all you need remember is just the hive.sc and to enter the room demo for room. I'll just give a few more moments for other people to join if they can. And hopefully we have enough for a demonstration to take place here. Excellent. So we can use this system just to poll people as if we're polling them individually, and we can just ask them very simple questions. Like we can ask them, how are you feeling? Are you feeling happy, like Farrell? You can drag your dot over to the left. Are you feeling miserable like Morrissey? And what we can do, thus what the system does, is stream the exact XY position of those dots moment by moment. So we're collecting data for every moment of every movement by anybody at any moment in time. So most people are feeling happy or insanely hyperactive and they can't bounce down, or perhaps bipolar, bouncing back and forth. Great, so we can poll how people are feeling. Now, just a little thing, when it says get in the Hive, move into the middle, drag yourselves into the middle of the screen, and that just sort of resets the dots a little bit. It might be they're having a lag, people are finding that difficult. And we can ask various questions, not very important questions. We can ask people like, how often do you pick your nose? Drag your dots to never and constantly. And what you'll see here, of course, is that those dots have disappeared. I'm still tracking your dot position as an individual, but now you can't see the responses of everyone else in the room. So you can answer privately. You can confess to this disgusting habit that is probably spreading a pandemic right now, and you needn't be ashamed, unless that is that I turn the dots back on. And now we can see other people's behavior. And at its very simplest level, this is the behavior that we're interested in. How do your decisions, your responses change when you're making them privately versus in the context of seeing what other people are doing? So at its simplest level, lots of our experiments simply turn these dots on and off or change how these dots appear to try and get a sense of how decisions can be shifted and changed in real time, looking at the responses of the people around you. So let's just try a few more demos. Again, let's see if they work with the lag. If you go to the middle, of course, many of you will have heard of these demonstrations. What I want you to do now is guess the weight of the liger. That is a cross between a lion and a tiger. It's a real animal. You might have seen, there's one on the Tiger King if you saw it there. It goes from 0 to 100 kilograms. So drag your dot estimating how heavy you think that creature is. I'll give you a few more moments to give your response. That's very, very good. And now I'm going to put on screen the dots and the average response, which is going to be a star. So you were pretty damn close, right? That big blue star is the average response of all of those dots. You can see it moving as people move now. And your response is about 480. The correct answer is 410. So that's a pretty good demonstration that together, even though individually we may never have heard of a liger, we don't know the weight, average your responses and they become very accurate. Let's repeat this. Let's try this again. How much does this creature weigh? That's an adult female killer whale or orca. Again, I'll give you a few moments now. It's kilograms again, but it's gone up by a factor of 10. And we'll see where the responses go. Okay, now here, the actual correct answer, and there you see a gold star, was in spatially exactly the same area. But you'll notice what happened there is the moment I switched this slide and you started to give your answer, you crept farther and farther away from the correct answer. What I'm going to do is do a few more bits of these demos, then we're going to go back and unpick some of the behavior, and I'll give you my guess as to why you're behaving this particular way. Here's another test of your London knowledge. I don't know if anyone else is in London right now, but this is a spatial quiz. So you drag your dot to give me an indication of where in London some of these things are. And I want you to try and get your individual answer as accurate as possible. Where in London is there the most gun and knife crime? You can see some of the landmarks there, just to help you. So drag your dots to try and give me an answer to where's the most violent place in London. And the correct answer is hauntingly accurate. Look at that, right on top of the dot. Well done. Maybe those are people who are there right now, fearing for their lives. I forget where that is. If anyone knows where that is, let me know. It's somewhere in South London, obviously. Okay, so that's where is the most gun and knife crime. And I'll unpick that demo later, right? I'm just going to go through a few different experiments, then we'll go back to the talk and I'll explain what we've been manipulating. What I want you to do now is to pick your favorite bit of modern art. Just drag your dot to whichever painting there speaks to you. Of course, there are many psychologists in the audience who already know what we're doing right now, but guess your favorite bit of art. And then what I would normally tell my audience is I'm a psychologist and your favorite bit of art has given me insight into your mind and I can tell you what sort of person you are. And amazingly, people believe me when I say this. And I say I've turned you into either red or blue people. So can you drag your dot to the corner of the screen according to which side you're on? And let me just, so you should be able to see, drag your dot to the right if you're red, to the left if you are blue. Let me just see if we can turn that on. Okay, now what I want you to do is to move yourselves. Whoop, I think we're having problems with the system now. It looks to be overloaded. Perhaps this may be the moment when we have to stop playing, I'm afraid. Looks like we might have stopped it being able to work. It's just got stuck in a loop now. And let me just try and refresh. Yeah, I think that's very sad. I think we might, well, let's give it one last go here. Let's try that. Yeah, it's unable to share the images, I'm afraid. Hang on, let's just try here. We're going to get anything? The server has given up on us, I'm afraid. It's no longer broadcasting the image behind these slides, I'm afraid. Never mind, I will show you the examples and videos of other people playing. I just wanted to show you this so you get a sense of the sorts of behaviors we can measure in this particular system. So I'm going to go back to the talk and sort of unpick a few of those demonstrations that we gave. So you can put away your phones now. Thank you for participating. It worked for a good 7 minutes, which is 7 more minutes than I imagined it would. So this system is called the Hive, and we've used it in various ways. If you're interested in using it, if you can envision an experiment that you could do with a large number of people using this system, please, we're always happy to talk about collaborations. So what have we been doing? Let me just unpick a few of the demonstrations. The first one, of course, is probably very familiar to you. It's the wisdom of the crowds. This thing that Galton, Darwin's racist cousin, noticed a good 100 years ago, that if you looked at the average of a large number of responses, that average almost always outperformed any one individual. And this has been popularized in a great book by Sareki recently as well. But we were interested in this when we were thinking about collective action. But of course, there's a whole other literature in psychology about when we're very bad at making group decisions. Janice's work on groupthink and the madness of crowds and the sort of ways that social forces can lead people to polarize their opinions when they're in groups and get farther and farther away from the correct answer. So we want to try and understand, well, when is it that a group of people have wisdom as a crowd? When is it that this goes wrong and they spiral off into crazy directions? Well, Lorenz already gave some experiments suggesting that it's really just a little bit of social interaction, a little bit of information about each other ruins the wisdom of the crowd effects. So they did experiments looking at the average number of murders that happen in a capital. Just guess the average number of murders that are in Brussels, for example. And people would guess by themselves, write down an answer they would average, you'd get the wisdom of the crowd's effect. But then they asked them to do the same thing, but have a little discussion, to share ideas. And what happened in that moment is people started to think of the grisly murders, the popular murders. They started to discuss it, and they started to get farther and farther from the truth. They were biasing each other. So all of that social interaction was dragging them away from the true estimation, because they were sharing the most notable, the most visible cases of murder, which of course are not true reflection of the base rate. So we tried to sort of replicate this in the Hive, again, in a very simple way, just by making people make these group judgments and having the dots being there or not. And what we found, and we saw this in the moments that you did it too, is I left the dots on when I asked you about the orca, right? This is another group at the bottom, given their responses about the liger, and they gave an answer about it as close as yours. But when you ask people to do the orca, what happens is people start to follow each other's dots. They see that everyone else is over here, so they move over here. Their movement moves this dot a bit farther, and everyone else sort of shuffles, and everyone gradually shuffles along and gets farther and farther away from their true estimation. So any little bit about social information about the people around you was dragging them away from this idealized, wise response. Social information is destroying the wisdom of the crowds. So we got very interested in this fact, and we were thinking, well, is it always true? Is there some sort of limit to this particular phenomena? Does it have to happen that if we interact with each other, we get stupider? If so, that will be disastrous for democracy. And there are many examples of that in front of us right now. But we're interested in how people understood the task, and whether or not how they understood themselves as a group would change this response. And that's where we came up with this London experiment that you did one trial of. So here what we did was ask people to make these spatial decisions about where there are the most trees in London, where's the most crime, and so on and so on. And they were doing it in small groups of about 6. And this is an example data here where each color is a different group, and the bigger dots, that's the center point of the estimate. And the correct answer for this one is across there. And what you see with this particular question is that people are quite accurate, right? Those big blobs are pretty close to the cross, the correct answer. But also there's quite a big distribution of responses. So here we see a big distribution of responses, the average of which is quite accurate. Let me move that to the middle. So this is the sort of behavior we got when people could see each other's dots, but importantly, when we told them that they should act as a group, that as a collective, they should try and get the right answer. We get a big distribution of responses, the average of which is pretty accurate. However, we also told people, don't try and get the answer right as a group, try and get the answer right as an individual. Just you, don't worry about other people. You can see their dots, or we remove them, but in this condition, they could see their dots, but it's you, worry about your accuracy. And sort of counterintuitively, to me at least, what we found is if we told people to act as individuals, they then started to conform. They started to cluster and went closer together. In getting closer together, they also dragged themselves away from the true answer, just like we saw in the case of the orca. So the reason I say this is counterintuitive is when we told people to act as a collective, they were more diverse, and through that were actually wiser. When we told people to act as individuals, they acted like a herd, copied each other, and got narrower and less wise. So this sort of counterintuitive thing that we had wisdom through this diversity of opinion. We can talk about this result as well. We were able to demonstrate it purely by turning these dots on and off, purely by giving people a different frame for how they understood what the goal of the group was. So it's not always the case that we become less wise when we act together. This only seems to happen if we're primed to act as individuals, because that's when we start copying each other, and that conformity drags us away from the correct answer. Okay, this is where the demonstration started to break down, sadly. We also got interested in group behavior, not just as everyone is in the group together, but in separate social identities. Of course, these social identities, how we dress, how we appear, these structure our lives, from our understanding of ourselves to who we mingle with to how we act and so on. Here's some examples of people. I don't even know what those people on the top right are, but I presume that's a social group that they have all of themselves. So we wanted to try and see what's the effect of feeling like you're part of a group. And to do this, of course, we use the, let me just explain. This is work done with Fergus Neville and part of Steve Reicher's groups and John Jury, people who study social identity. And they had demonstrated previously, this is not my work, that social identities really, from the ground up in terms of our behavior, they have an influence. And they examined the effect of social identities on something that supposedly as automatic as yawning behavior. I've just realized this is a terrible slide to show last thing on a Friday because you're all might have been yawning previously, now even more. What they did was show videos like this to their participants, but they manipulated the social identity. So they said, here's a picture of some other undergraduates, and they are members of your university or the university next door that there was a rivalry with. And they found if these people believed they were St. Andrews people and they were from St. Andrews too, that supposedly purely automatic yawning behavior was more contagious, if that's even the right metaphor. You're more likely to copy people. They did another experiment where they gave you a Tupperware box, and you open the Tupperware box and there was some gym socks in there, some sweaty sports socks, and you sniffed them and said how disgusting they were. And they were less disgusting if you thought those were the gym socks of your football team, the football team from your university. So really basic things like this yawning response, like this disgust response, are structured by these social identities. So we wanted to know, well, can we find evidence for this in our collective experiments? Can we find evidence that people are being dragged around by the mere suggestion of a group identity? Now, of course, whether or not you support Arsenal, whether or not you're a goth or an emo person, those are very strong social identities. But the remarkable thing that social psychologists have discovered is that you need very little reason to start feeling you're part of a group and then to start to discriminate people who are not in your group. This is the famous minimal group paradigm that, of course, you probably realize the manipulation. People chose these paintings, and then at random, I made them red or blue. So they think they're there for a reason. They're there with people who are also have the same preferences or the same personality, but of course it's actually entirely randomized. What we did then is give them a task. This is exactly when it failed for us. I apologize for that. Where we asked them to drag their dots up into the hive. And you'll notice here, there are some dots that are round there, some dots that are square. What we did is everyone has a round dot, but when we jumped to this slide, we introduced some confederates, some dots that were pre-programmed, that were not people in the room. There were the dots that were we controlled. And I made them squares here, but when the participants saw them, they just thought there were other people in the room with them. Then what they did, we said, okay, start at the yellow dot, then just go to either of those green blobs. Just drag your blob around. And of course, we programmed it so our Confederate red dots went one way and our Confederate blue dots went another. And what we found is that people followed their Confederates. If the blue guys are going over here, they went, okay, and they followed the blue ones over there. So in these very small arbitrary decisions, those group paradigms, those group identities we gave them were structuring their behavior. This is another case where we asked them lots of questions like, would you rather be a dragon or have a pet dragon? That caused, actually, that one caused too many arguments. We had to stop using that one because people got so upset about the answer. And while waiting for the next question, they moved up to the hive, but the red guys would fidget more. They would just move around a little bit more. And that behavior was contagious. That seemed to spread, but only amongst the other red people. So lots of these behaviors that people aren't even consciously reflecting on, we would imagine, you're still copying the people who are in your group. Even when that in your group is as shallow as some bearded psychologist said, you're all red people. That is enough for you to start selectively copying the people around you. This work was done at the London Science Museum as a sort of installation, and it just came out a few weeks ago, actually. So here's the data of people being dragged over to the left, dragged over to the right as a function of their dot color. This is the last thing that we did in the hive that, again, just collapsed before we did it. We also got interested in group behavior in a very different context in terms of rioting. We had these London riots in 2012. We got very interested in the behavior. Rioting is a fascinating behavior because often it seems from the outside to be entirely self-destructive. It happened in where I live in Ealing, which is a very middle-class area, but people go to the shopping centers and they were smashing up their own parks, they were smashing up their own shops, and it was hard to see what is the value of that, right? You're harming your own environment in a purely rational way. You know, what goods are you getting? There was some looting, but not very much at all. It was sort of a venting of something. And we got very interested in this notion of sort of self-harm at this group societal level. Why would you harm your own environment? What function is that performing? And there's various hypotheses were floated at the time about why these London riots might be happening. David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, his explanation was these are simple yobs. These are just terrible people who are giving vent to their natural instincts. And they use the language of wild animals. Their youth have gone feral, right? They always use these sorts of language. There are other notions that it was all about the social identity and the history of those particular people in Tottenham and the particular history that they had with the police. And it was an outcome of a really long sort of historical struggle between them. We became interested in another potential explanation that's much older, sort of began in the 50s with Gurr and other people thinking about equality. There has been some studies very recently suggesting that many of our social ills, things like depression, incarceration rates, they're related to poverty. Sure, right? When we get poor as a society, these problems bubble up. But over and above being related to poverty, they're related to fairness and equality in societies. So it doesn't matter so much the amount of money a particular country or a particular city has, how fairly that's distributed seems to have a really strong correlation to a number of social ills like depression rates, like diabetes rates, the rate people are obese or get sent to jail. There seems to be something fundamentally important about feeling that you're in an unequal society. It's bad if you're at the bottom, but it's also psychologically bad if you're at the top. This is the emerging evidence from Wilkinson and Pickett wrote The Spirit Level, which has sort of inspired us to that. So we thought, well, can we test this hypothesis in the context of something like a riot? We can't literally have a riot in our lab, but can we make a little game version of it and try and tap into some of the same feelings, some of the same responses to inequality? So we created this game called Park Life. That's people at the London Science Museum playing it there, where it's like those little, farm simulators where you tap, you do work and you grow your farm. You tap on your phone, and the more you tap as a group, you grow these little park features. And it sounds very simple, but people quite enjoy playing this, right? It's just quite satisfying for a park to grow in front of you. But then, of course, because we're mean psychologists, we make this unfair. And we change the rules such that for one team, they are disadvantaged. They have to tap even more. They have to do more effort to get the same amount of features. It's unfair for them. We also give people the choice. They can tap, tap, tap to grow, or they can flick a switch and they can tap and they can trash the other team's park. You see a park bench being broken there. Now, rationally speaking, that doesn't help you, right? If you're spending time trashing the other team's thing, that's you're not growing your own park. So if you're purely trying to win this game, this is not a good behavior. But we found, and that's what you see in the bottom right, that's the vandalism actions as a function of the team identity. Red here are the disadvantaged ones. And they build together, then pretty soon they switch and they start to vandalize. So what we're finding is purely as a function of being in this unequal feeling that things are stacked against you, people aggress. They take part in this irrational behavior, they act out, and they attack the other team. We're trying now to sort of probe with computational models and other experimental manipulations. Is this purely an emotional frustration thing? Is this a strategic thing? You think, well, I'm not going to win, so I might as well do this. Does it depend on how strong the feelings of your group bond are? What if it's not red and blue, but pre-existing social identities? Like if you play men against women, right? Is there a difference in the tolerance for inequality because of the history of those particular social groups? So we proved this basic notion to our satisfaction anyway. There's a link between inequality and this sort of self-harm at a group level, but exactly why it happens, that's what we're trying to unpick now. So what I want to do now is, let me just check the time. Oh, that's okay. I want to pivot and talk about another aspect of our research that's looking at collective experience. So this is people as, passive is a contentious term, people who are experiencing something together. What is the value of that togetherness? Can we put a number on it? Can we try and understand what it does for them, and try and figure out if we can replicate it in some way? I'll come to that right at the end. And this actually began purely as a sort of actually a consulting project. Some people who sold tickets to the theatre in the West End in London came to us and they said, we want to understand why people go out to the theatre. And we thought, well, what do you mean? The theatre's great. They said, well, yeah, but people have a 4K TV at home. Why don't they just sit and watch stuff there? Right? Why would they bother to get on the tube, pay hundreds of pounds, sit in a tiny Victorian seat? The ceilings kept falling in at these theatres at the time. Why would you go through all that when you could have the same or an even better perceptual experience at home? So we thought, that's quite an interesting question. We tried to turn it into a hypothesis where we could get data. Let me just back up and come from a different direction. How do we measure these experiences? Of course, people have used surveys to try and get people's opinions about performance and their experience, but we wanted a way to capture what people are going through that didn't mean interrupting that experience. And so we turned to these physiological sensors that we had from another project where I was looking at dancers synchrony with Guido Orgs. So we had these things and we put them on people's wrists while they went to the theater. Now, you might think that these sensors, of course, they're very good at sort of fitness, about seeing your heart rate while you do exercise like this gentleman. But what do they really tell you about psychology? Well, in a separate project, we also use them with Audible. Audible were interested in the experience of listening to an audiobook. So we use these same sensors, and this is an experiment we set up. So what we did is people listened to a 3-minute passage from, say, the Game of Thrones. They listened to that audiobook, or they watched a closely matched video version of it from a TV show or a movie. And of course, you can never get exactly the same thing because people take liberties with the adaptation. But as close as we could get it, it was the same story, the same duration. But you're either listening to that in an audiobook or watching it. And people did this with 8 different stories while they wore their sensors. And we asked people, which was the most engaging? Which did you enjoy most of these two things? And reliably, they said the TV version was great, right? That's HBO's rendition of Westeros. It's incredibly detailed and accurate and beautiful. They paid millions of pounds to get that set, and that's where they felt most transported. But if we looked at their physiology, if we looked at their heart rate, which you see on the y-axis on that graph, if we looked at their electrodermal activity, how much they were sweating, if we looked at their body temperature, they were more physiologically engaged when listening to the audio book. They said they were more engaged by the TV, but their brains were ticking over more. They're engaging their autonomic system more just when listening to that audiobook. Well, why is there that difference? Our hypothesis is, well, when you watch the HBO version, HBO have done the hard work of the imagination, right? They've paid all those extras. You have very skilled actors recreating it all. You just sit and passively you take in that stimulus. When you're listening to the audiobook, you have to do the work of generating, of imagining what people look like, of thinking about what their reactions are, of simulating that whole thing. And that act of imagination, we can read off at the wrist. That purely imaginative world was having an effect, was engaging your physiological system, and we could capture it with our little devices. So all of that was just a digression to try and suggest to you that we can use these physiological sensors for psychologically interesting things. And I'll try and make that point. So we are interested, let's go back to the main question about this collective experience, not people by themselves listening to audiobooks. Let's think about people going to the theater. So we went to Dreamgirls, which was on at the Savoy, and we measured people's physiology. We put them on about 20 people while they were enjoying this musical. And this is sort of the basic data that we got. This is sort of the least interesting thing about the data to us. We just measure people's heart rates during the performance. And if you look at sort of the British Heart Foundation, these sorts of places, they'll say that if you're going to do mild exercise, you want your heart rate elevated into a certain zone. And it's sort of above sort of 60–70% of your resting heart rate, very, very roughly, changes by age and so on. And all we've done here is just plot everyone's heart rate, and we just shaded in, on average, where is that exercise zone? And what we found is that for most people, when they went to the theater, they were in that exercise zone for about 30 to 40 minutes. We didn't think this was particularly interesting, but this got written up as going to the theater is just like going to the gym, which is not what we said at all. But people love this story, and it was. But this work got more attention than all the rest of my work put together, and it's not even a very good experiment. It was crazy. But people, I think, were really fascinated by this notion that scientists could even validate or measure in any way that experience of the theater. So this got a lot of, not necessarily wanted attention, that there's some comparison between being in the theater. And it is mildly interesting that just sat there passively engaging this thing is elevating your heart at least as much as sort of walking around the block quickly. But it does get more interesting when we started to examine exactly what was the average heart rate profile over the performance. So when looking at live theater, this is the mean normalized heart rate of the audience, and there are particular peaks and troughs here, right? If we were all having random responses to what was happening, this would average out to a flat line, but this is not a flat line. So this is people who are watching Dreamgirls live in the theater. The good thing about Dreamgirls was there was a movie adaptation that's roughly the same length, and we could show that movie adaptation to people in the lab in small groups or individuals and compare things. So this is people watching the movie in a small group. And there's two things about this graph that I want to point out. One is that we've got peaks and troughs again, and they line up. Why is it that they line up? Why is there a peak about just past half the way through and about 3/4 of the way through? Well, the only explanation we have is that's the story. That's the narrative arc, which is the same in the movie and the theater, right? That lump just past half time, that I think is when she gets kicked out of the band. The other one is when she gets divorced. And then the final one is the band gets back together, and it's very emotional, if you like that sort of thing. So that is narrative that's driving that physiological response. And it's a narrative that's in common in these two adaptations, but across them, we've seen the same response. That's people watching the movie in a small group. If they're watching alone, there's the other thing I wanted to point out, is the lines are much flatter. So in general, we think of exciting things as raising the heart rate, and that's certainly true. But also, if something is really engrossing, your heart rate will lower. You know, we even call them heart-stopping moments. If you're focusing on something, it can be a hard maths problem. You tend to lower your physiology, you sort of ramp down, possibly so you can focus on this thing. So what we find is in the theater that people tell us is more engaging, we got bigger peaks and bigger troughs as well. And if we capture that variance between it, we're getting a bigger range of heart rates for the live theater, and possibly even as a function of the number of people you're seeing the movie with. We also we're interested in, well, is there something special about live performance? Does this happen in sort of other contexts as well? We also went to the cinema as well, when Aladdin, the movie, was released, and we captured the same things with our physiological senses, and we found the same thing, that there are peaks and troughs that seem to correspond to things that were happening. About 3/4 of the way through, we're getting a peak there with everyone's heart rate went up, and that's the moment that Aladdin gets his first kiss. And literally, in a pragmatic way, everyone's heart flutters a little bit. We get this increase in heart rate. So we're interested in in a gross way, does everyone's heart rate go up or down? Sort of just average, what's the average profile across the performance? But also, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, we're also interested in a finer level of granularity. To what degree are the heart rates synchronizing? Are people physiologically coordinating the activity of their bodies? And this is where we turn back to our technique of cross-recurrent analysis to put a number on the degree to which audience heartbeats were beating in time with each other. They were coordinating their physiological response. And here we found an even bigger difference between the theater and the movie. People seem more coordinated in their response while in the theater together, co-present with each other, compared to the movie. And this is what I'm going to drill down on for the rest of the talk, looking at this physiological coordination. Now, we know, of course, I'm sure I don't need this for the current crowd, of course, that behavioral coordination is a very broad phenomena. We see it in flamingos. We see it in Trump's press secretary. He was only press secretary for 10 days. He copied every single gesture of Trump's in that one moment. It's quite astonishing, trying to ingratiate himself with the silverback of the group there. In the bottom right, that's me trying out my motion tracker with 2 undergraduates, and I was fiddling with some numbers, and so they just started to flirt with each other because they're 18, and that's what 18-year-olds do if you leave them. So that's 2 people flirting with each other. See how they sort of copy their body sway? There's a coordination. They start to sway in time with each other in many ways. And we've seen some of them across this workshop, of course. This sort of coordination of behavior increases affiliation. It seems to be closely related to individual and group bonding. But as I'm sure you know, it's not just behavioral coordination. Coordination under the skin matters as well. If 2 people who are in love, a couple, stare at each other into their eyes, their heart rates will start to synchronize with each other. Of course, is the famous work by Ivanka Konlikova, who put the same heart rate sensors on people in a Spanish village doing the walking across the hot coals. And what she found was she measured the heart rate synchrony between the walker, the fire walker, and the people watching, and found that there was a coordination between them. She's used the same cross-recurrence analysis as we do. Not only was there a coordination, but that coordination was related to the degree of relatedness between the 2. So if you were the mother and that was your son walking across, you had a very tight coordination. That was your brother, slightly less, your cousin, slightly less again. So that she could read out the entire familial structure of the village just through those heart rate coordinations. And we know from Emma Cohen's work as well that teams, if they coordinate their physiology, that changes things like their pain thresholds, their endorphins shift if they've been coordinating their behavior with each other. So based upon all this work, we were thinking, well, are all of these effects of physiology being coordinated? Is that why being part of an audience is so rewarding? because in some way, possibly just hearing each other gasp, seeing everyone else sway in time, there's something about that co-presence they're able to use as a signal to coordinate our physiology and have some sort of different experience. That's the conclusion we're trying to chase. And when we looked at our data, we did seem to find indications of this. So in that experiment where we looked at Aladdin in the cinema, we put a number on the heart rate synchrony between people who are in the cinema together, and also between people who are just reading a book in the same room for the same amount of time, just as a comparison. What we found was that there was greater heart rate synchrony for the people who watched that film together. But we also asked them, how socially connected do you feel to the people also reading a book? How socially connected do you feel to the people walking out of the cinema together? They're strangers to you, but you just watched the same movie. And we found that there was more of a social connection if you just watched the cinema. That's the red on the y-axis. But even more than that, there was a correlation between the degree to which your heart was coordinated with the hearts of other people and the degree to which you felt this social connection. So we're starting to get these indications that these things are related in some way. Now, there's also a separate stream of work that happened before us, people like Domachowski, who are finding out this strange similar effect. There's something about coordinated brain or physiological activity that is telling you something important about engagement or about the power or success of a stimulus. So in this work, they measured the brain activity of about 20 people who are watching adverts that were shown during one of the Super Bowls. And they measured the brain activity, and using a different technique from us, I think it was wavelet analysis, they too put a number on how coordinated was that brain activity. Not did a certain region go up or down, or was there a certain pattern, just whatever's going on, is it the same between people? And what they found is the more similar the brain activation was, the more coordinated the brain activation was, that correlated with how well those adverts were received, how many YouTube clicks, how many likes they got, how successful that stimulus was. And they also asked those 20 people, which do you think was the best advert? But it was their coordination and their brain activity that had the stronger predictor to the overall success of the stimuli, rather than what they actually said. So there have been several other demonstrations like this, suggesting that if you get something that has a coordinated physiological response between people, that is doing something well. It's engaging the audience, it's getting a good response. So inspired by this work and others, we thought, well, we don't have a whole brain net to measure the activity, but we do have these physiological sensors. Can we find evidence of this too? So we realized actually that we were sitting on this data because way back in that Audible experiment, as I told you, we showed you video clips of people watching the Game of Thrones and so on, and we had the ratings of people's physiology watching them. So we thought, well, let's run the numbers. Let's see if there's coordination in that physiology, not just what are those overall levels. Is there a difference between audiobooks and videos? But what's the coordination? And we asked, does that correlate with the IMDb ratings for that excerpt of the Game of Thrones or for that TV show? And what we found was a correlation. The more people had synchronized, this is from their galvanic skin response, their EDA, the more there was coordination in that signal, the higher those things are rated in IMDb. We thought this is a little ridiculous, so let's try and replicate this. We took some movie trailers of movies that hadn't come out yet, and we show people these movie trailers. And again, we measured their physiology with these sensors. And then later we waited for a few months to see what the global box office takings from these trailers. And we found, well, if you ask people, did you like this trailer? Would you like to see it? How would you rate your engagement? Those things did not predict global box office sales. But once more, the coordination in the physiology did. We got a coordination between how similar was the trajectory of physiological response while watching this trailer with gross worldwide takings. So we think there's something really quite interesting going on here. And let me just go back saying, we're not really quite sure why it is that this is working. Why should there be such a connection between the two of these things? Just to say at this point, there was a career goal that slipped through my fingers at this point. I was going to be internationally famous, and then I wasn't, because we realized the moment when we're doing this that, well, we think we can predict success of a stimulus based on the coordination, how people respond. And it was around February time, and they just had the preliminary rounds of the Eurovision Song Contest. And we had a whole experiment lined up of showing people, Azerbaijan's entry and Poland's entry, and we were measuring the physiology, and we were going to predict the winner of the Eurovision Song Contest and be incredibly famous and completely sell out our careers. And then the pandemic hit and the whole thing was cancelled. So yes, that was my my brush with fame that never was. We were going to do this. But this is how we'd want to take this work forward, is saying, well, what exactly does this predict? We find that we're able to use the same techniques to predict the success of Kickstarter campaigns. So a Kickstarter campaign, you put on a video saying, I've invented this new type of bike, give me money for so I can make the product, and people do or don't. And the coordination of their physiological response seems to map onto the success of these campaigns. We're trying to find out more broadly if this works. So let me this is the last thing I want to tell you about. So we also took this back to our understanding of audiences. Maybe that the big value of seeing something as a collective surrounded by other people, the payoff that you get is something to do with that physiological coordination. And literally days before it was locked down, this was sometime in March, one of our graduate students went to the English National Opera where Carmen was playing, and she measured the physiology of people watching and then asked them about their experience of the performance and asked them whether or not this was a standardized scale, how captivating it was, how emotionally engaged, how socially engaged, and found these really remarkable correlations, the strength of how, so the degree to which they felt spiritually uplifted by this piece of music correlated 0.7 with our measures of the coordination in their physiology. These are, we did a double take and had to rerun these numbers. So we think that we don't really understand what it is yet, to be perfectly frank, but there seems to be something really quite fundamental about this coordination and a physiological response and what it's doing for you as an audience member. And of course, then the lockdown started, and that's when we all didn't need our research to tell us how valuable collective experiences were, because we're all hugely missing going to the cinema, going to a performance. So it was a very sad time, obviously, for everyone for this particular avenue of research, because we couldn't run experiments on people anymore. But then we thought, well, maybe we can, because technology is awesome. And we had a computer science department at UCL. And I talked to a gentleman, Youngjun, and I was telling this about this research. And he said, well, I've got an app on a phone, and you just put your finger over the camera, and it can tell your heart rate, because he's hacked into the image processing there. And I don't know if when you're a kid, you put a torch up to your finger and your finger glows, right? Like your EET. Well, it uses the same sort of system, light to illuminate the finger, and then slight changes in the blood flow you can detect with an algorithm, and you can figure out someone's heart rate. So then we realized, oh, we can track people's heart rate while they're sat at home. That's step one. And then step two was, okay, so if we can measure people's heart rates while they're sat at home watching a live YouTube stream, if they're all in a club together watching a performer singing, they'll be able to get a sense of perhaps of that energy. They'll be able to hear each other breathing or clapping or moving, and they get a payoff through coordinating their physiology. Well, can we somehow give that to people even when they're scattered around the world? So this is what we call the Collective Heartbeat Project. And we got some performers. This is a lady called Katie, who's a folk singer, and she performed on a live YouTube stream. We got 100 people watching her, all sat at home with their little app, putting their fingers over the screen. That information from each of their individual phones was streamed to a server, and we put on screen a representation of the synchrony in our heart rate. That's a little circle thing, whoops, that you see playing there. Let me just go back a second, if we can see that playing. So it's an imperfect visualization. This was literally our first attempt to it, but it was getting bigger as heart rates went up, and the line was getting thicker the more there was in relation to the variance in that signal. So that's a picture of how excited people are, or how much their physiology is going up, and also the similarity in that response. And we were interested in whether having that information about the collective heartbeat would change your experience in some way. So we did this as a controlled experiment where you either just saw Katie, then you rated the experience, or you saw it with a visualization, but we didn't tell you what it was. It was just a distracting thing pulsing. Or you have the visualization and we say that is the heartbeat of other people watching right now. And as I say, this is very, very pilot work. But what we found, if you look at the central graph there, we plotted the performance engagement on the y-axis. And if you had that visualization, that's the blue blob, you're more engaged in that performance. You are more excited by it. You are more sort of captivated by it. If you had this readout of the collective physiology of the group. So that's Katie, the middle plot. There's also a plot to the left of a lady called Ellen, who was a performance poet who read some poetry there. And there you see it didn't work. right? So I'm not claiming this is a technique that has limitations for sure. And one reason we think, in retrospect, it seems obvious, was, of course, the poetry was quite abstract, quite difficult. You had to focus, and this thing was just distracting. Music, because of the nature, you could enjoy what she was doing while looking at this visual display, and there wasn't a competition between these stimuli. That's our guess anyway. But of course, what we want to do now is use this technique and see if more broadly we can implement it. See, what are the limits? Is it just music? Will this work with plays? Can we change that visualization to be more engaging in some way, and to try and experimentally really tease apart if we're onto something here? So that's our collective heartbeat project. And I just wanted to end with that, because we're also miserable about not being able to go to the theatre, not being able to experience these things, about having conferences that are on Zoom that are fantastic. Well, it's done a wonderful job, but we can't now go to the pub and actually be present with each other. But there is still a way to do research, and there's still a way perhaps to give something of that collective experience back to people. That's what we hope to be doing in the future. But I think I've more than used up your patience here, so I'm going to end there. These are my collaborators that I'm very grateful to, and to you for your time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Daniel. That was as wonderful as I had hoped it would be to bring our program to a close, and you've managed to touch upon so many of the many themes that we've covered over the last few days. So it was a great way of, on the one hand, and most generally, just showing us the interaction between physical coordination, so with your hive, obviously, but also then coordination of minds, bodies, and souls and emotions. And so it really was a wonderful way to bring together two large group bodies of work, which I've also tried to make sure are similarly represented over the course of the last 3 days, because sometimes we forget that we as acting creatures are sometimes coordinating at a bodily level, and that sometimes this has results on and effects on our physiology, and then also on our feelings and emotions, and those again have in turn effects on our physiology, but all these scales somehow interact. So I think what your work puts right out there is that physiology, physicality, emotions are all deeply coupled. So I want to thank you, first of all, for doing that. And the YouTube live stream went crazy, but I didn't want to interrupt your flow, because it was so great. So I have a couple of comments that are not questions per se, but Travis Wiltshire just says he likes your phrase of physiological orchestration. And they're all very sad that you couldn't predict the Eurovision winner. So hopefully next week
so close. I mean, it was going to be Iceland. Everyone knew it was going to be Iceland, so it wouldn't have been that surprising. But still, if we could predict the third, fourth place, that would be great. Next year you're on it, and I'll please tell me beforehand so I can put some money on it. So Peter Koenig from here in Germany gives you a round of applause and says thank you for the presentation. Everybody's saying thank you. I have a question for you regarding performance. So when you go to the theatre, and I wondered one thing I didn't see, but you've probably done because you've done everything, is one thing I've always wondered is whether, as most theatre, opera, and so on, has multiple individuals, not just so that they can tell cool stories, but as I think that often seeing people being coupled is contagious in itself. So you talked about contagion with yawning, and you've mentioned Ivana Konvalinka's work. I wonder if one of the reasons why it's so exciting and thrilling being in theatre is that you have more direct access to their coupling. So when you're watching films, often you'll have a close-up on one particular actor, and so you're often pulled away from looking at people's interaction on stage. So there's something about always being aware of the coupling on stage, which is also quite moving in a way. So I wonder if it would be worth putting your senses on your performers as well. We did ask, but the dresses in Dreamgirls were so tight they refused to let any sort of censor on them. But we did explore that avenue, and yeah, that would be something that would be fantastic to look at. Yeah, is there some sort of entrainment that you have with particular people? If you emphasize with that character, but then that's a horrible guy and he's going to betray her, are you selectively in training to the people that you support, right? That's what a good play will do, is sort of pull your emotions to one side or another. Could you see that in the entrainment between the audience members and particular people on stage? Will be phenomenal to see.
I think that would be really interesting, yeah, because it's sort of something that you alluded to, and which obviously data like that you collect from the Hive is relative distance, right, between me and you. And often what you're doing in these collective acts, but also in collective decision making, is you're making you're making judgments as to how far I am from you, whether it's how far are we in opinions or how far are we in space, and then you use that information to guide your future action. So I wonder, a lot of what you were talking about is just coordination generally, and how coupled we are. But I wonder whether you could use distance from, and you just mentioned, how much do you hate that character? Is it's a big distance. Whether you could use distance more in your data, which is, I think, something which sort of reminds us that you can use the same data in lots of different ways.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, we have accelerometers, but you really want to map out the spatial locations, like Sandy Pentland does with sort of people at MIT or moving around a conference, right, to try and spatially locate everyone and use the same mass that you do for sort of wildebeest feeding, right, to see if you can spot patterns in sort of migration here that might relate to some of that synchrony. That would be fabulous.
Well, I particularly like the way you distinguish between herds and herd activity versus obviously the more logical thing to do, which is to not necessarily herd, but use these brains that we were given and actually figure out that an orca is not that much heavier. But yeah, I think there's something in that as well.
The one thing that I really want to do with distance, which is sort of adjacent to your question, is to go to the Globe Theatre in London, which has this fabulous thing, because you've got the people in the rich seats up here, and then you've got, what do they call them? The groundlings, who are on the floor. And if you talk to the actors, they have a very different response to them, and they have actors will play up to the groundlings and get them on their side, and you have a very different relationship to them down there to the people watching up here. It's an entirely different experience. That's what the performers say anyway, and they try and recruit the crowd on their side, so they're cheering them and following their plans. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see if you could map out the emotional relationships in the theater that are separated by these spaces.
I think that would be amazing. And I along the same sort of lines is that you can have another form of distance, which is how close or how important and engaging the thing that you are dealing with is. And I thought it was quite interesting, the different games you played with us with the Hive. You had some things that clearly don't mean very much to me. I don't really care how heavy an orca is. Some people who are, natural history freaks will clearly care more. And then you moved on to art, which, for some of us might mean a lot, and we might be missing going to museums. And then you move to the furthest extreme, which is, going and choosing to go and be part of a live theater experience. People who do this, they care a lot about it. And I just thought this idea of how close you are, again, a question of distance, how close you are to the thing that you're engaging with is going to make a huge difference to your data. So I wonder whether we generally in the field have to be very careful when we try and create these models, and clearly what you do is so great because of this, is we have to make sure our models actually bear some semblance to this closeness, this another form of distance, closeness to the thing.
And that's just sort of not a career comment, but sort of a not really a non-scientific thing. That when we started to do this work on performance, you just realize just how boring the experiments that we do are in the lab, and how we only study such a reduced set of human experiences. And the interesting stuff is, the things that we value in life, which is live music, which is live theater, which is being around a large crowd of people. And you realize, why haven't we always been studying this stuff? Why have we done sort of psycholinguistic priming and other stuff that's really interesting? But we've sort of, I think in psychology, we got dragged into thinking everything interesting about behavior is the stuff we can put in the lab. So that's been one sort of just professional lesson to me, is to try and chase these things and grab whatever gadget you can, and to go where the real interesting experiences are, not where the interesting paradigms in your lab are.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's why I tried to get some artists to talk in our workshop just before you spoke. And because we obviously do need to still do lab studies. And I think that the beauty of, I need to get hold of your computer scientist, because I love your portable heart rate monitor, as it were, through the phone. But we need to maybe find, I think what a lot of your work does is finds a happy medium, right? So you still need to find ways of actually capturing that experience, and I think you've done that. There are some questions coming up, which I don't want to forget. So Sasha, says it might be worth looking at sites like Rotten Tomatoes because they give you a difference between expert opinions about movies and non.
Yeah, yeah.
I think is a really interesting point, if nothing else, that it brings up the other question I had in mind, which is about expertise, which you didn't talk too much about, which I really like as well. But it's a really nice point that if you haven't already done so, it might be worth looking at those ratings rather than just IMDb.
That's an excellent point, yeah, because there does seem to be, there's some indication, I don't think we have anything like proof, that these sort of physiological synchrony measures are tapping into, well, I want to say the common man, that's like a really old-fashioned phrase, but a basic response, not a sort of a critical response. So I think we would get that distinction. And of course, again, my career making failure, we're going to do this with the Eurovision Song Contest, because you've got you now have the popular vote, and you've got what the panels from the countries say. So we're interested in which one could we predict better, because they have those two types of data in the Eurovision Song Contest. So that was our gold standard test of that hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, you could do something similar in the political world, you know, the popular vote versus who actually ends up winning. Along those lines, maybe for a final question before we let you go, because you surely want to go and have a cup of tea and maybe relax a bit or catch up on all the work you've missed by doing this. But the other, somebody's asked about imitation between the example you put, obviously, just for example purposes, is Donald Trump and his press secretary. But I think the question is whether you've analyzed that data, but I suppose maybe even more importantly is there is the thought that it's nothing you said made me think that you've looked into this, but you almost certainly have, about leader-follower relationships. You know, because clearly you provide a phenomenon, you watch people, you know, coordinate around it. But it would be very interesting to know if you have ideas of how you would look at roles per se, you know, somebody setting an example and people following.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And that is, I don't think we've satisfactorily done that yet. So yeah, you'd think, you know, who's leading this dance and who's following who is a really fascinating question. And I think, again, if you look at the studies in behavioral imitation or in bodily coordination, they're almost always in an equal footing, because they're 2 undergraduates who are doing for the experiment for credit. So you very rarely have sort of interactions that are structured by this person is much more important than this one, or this person is much more attractive than the other one. There's really a default in the literature to look at quite sort of simple, non-socially structured interactions. So I really think it'd be very interesting. So, you know, we have this sort of basic truth that people mirror each other, then they like each other. But I think that's only true for a certain type of interaction. You know, you don't mirror your doctor when talking to him. You don't mirror the policeman because they'll think, you know, you're making fun of him. So I think if you look at these different types of social relationships, you might find a very different signature of coordination that will be very interesting. And I would love to look at this more in our data, but I don't think we have yet. But certainly statistically, we have the tools of cross-recurrence analysis. You can see, you can just read off who is leading it quite well. But I feel like I really should have a better answer to that question.
You know what you're doing next week.
Question, and it's in the data set. So that's something I would love to return to.
Great. I'm going to just give you one last point because it just struck me, and it seems so obvious that you almost always sort of have done it. But we often forget that we track emotion because it usually precedes behavior. And I wonder, in the theatre example context as well, you could also capture people's applause afterwards as a really nice, you know, overall, rather than just how, you know, your engagement response, you know, just a self-report measure is one way, but the applause might be one in which you also get some nice dynamic. You could use the data to look at coordination, right? But it would be nice to look at how emotion drives behavior.
People have tried to, for example, have cameras put on the audience member during a performance. This is someone at Queen Mary, Pat Heaney has done this, and he's used these algorithms that will do image processing and tell me you smiling or are you looking upset, these standard sort of algorithms. But what he found is during every performance, everyone looks angry and sad. And they're not, of course. What they're doing is being really still because they don't disturb the performance, or they're concentrating. And then the moment that the lights come up, or the moment that the performers can see them, then they look very happy and they signal. So there's a really interesting question about behavior used as a signal to people as well. And of course, applause is when you are free to signal, and that's when you're demanding the signal. but are you getting information in between the applause as well is really tricky. So perhaps since you're a performer, you would know better than me, but any performer that I've talked to claims that they have an immediate sense of how much the audience is captivated, the energy in the crowd. They can tell, is this working, is there not? And the good ones will adjust and change their timing and get them back on. But what is that signal that they're responding to? Is it the fidgeting that's happening? Is it hearing the breathing? No one can tell me exactly what it is, but they're absolutely certain. Yes, I could draw you the energy levels during that scene. Now they could
I would
be
say it's like
wrong,
a signal to noise where it's which ironically is an absolute stillness. Like when it's really working, there's this powerful feeling of absolute stillness and focus, and it just it's the drug, right? It's why you keep doing it. That feeling, and it's intense. Oh boy.
Where this comes from, I have no.
So it's almost certainly very multi-sensory, right? I'm sure it's very multi-sensory. Like this, it's a I think as from a very sort of animal level, there's so little going on. It's so quiet. It's so still. And so you know that the focus is entirely on you, and it's quite nice. It's a good feeling.
But then that would, I mean, just perceptually, that would be the same as them being really bored, wouldn't it?
No, because when people are bored, there's a lot of noise, right? So it's almost exactly what you were saying. There's this focus. And I think, more philosophically, it's almost like a case of joint attention. You feel like you're both focusing, both the and the performer are focusing on the thing that is being created, and you get this sense of, I know that you know that I am listening and you are listening to the same thing, and it's a case of joint attention. Right?
I mean, obviously I'm not a performer, but even just lecturing, you can tell there are times like, oh yeah, I nailed that conclusion. And again, you're responding to some signal in there, and even the students, right? And I'm hardly an engaging singer or anything like that, but you do have a sense of that. And if it is stillness, then can we experimentally manipulate that? Can we measure that? Can we put microphones in it and predict it? That's the next step that we'd like to do.
I think that will make you a lot of money. You'd make a lot of performers very happy.
Right.
To that, and then just give it to them at intermittent, points when we aren't able to go and sing, like in this horrible pandemic.
Right.
But on that note, I will leave you be. I want to thank you so much for your time and for your talk and for answering all these questions. And I hope that you can go to the pub sometime very soon with more than 5 people.
Yes. And thank you so much for the discussion. That's the payoff to me, is giving these talks and hearing the ideas back. And there were some wonderful suggestions today. So I very much appreciate that.
Not at all. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to say thank you to everybody who's watching, everybody who has been watching, and everybody who's going to be watching, because obviously we're going to leave this up so that people who weren't able to listen today can catch up later on. And that's really the beauty and power of technology, which you've also been spearheading in your talk, which is great. Technology is fantastic. We can feel connected. We can continue feeling connected. If people are interested in reaching out with anybody, collaborating, that is the real reason we have conferences. It's to gather together. It's to gather together to share ideas. And I'd really request that everybody who has that little itch goes and scratches it. Shoot that email out to the person you've been thinking about, and reach out, make those bridges. So thanks again to our keynote speaker, to all our speakers over the last 3 days, for everybody who's been commenting and just participating. We know you're out there, and it was nice to see the little blue dots, because I knew that you were out there. It was great. So thank you so much, everybody, and I wish you all a wonderful weekend, and stay in touch.